air in the room grows cold as I speak these words to you. Not because of any draft, but because some stories cling to the world like a fog that won't burn off in the morning sun. You are about to hear one of those stories. It's a tale buried so deep in the forgotten corners of Missouri history that even the local historians have learned to steer clear of it. A story that has been whispered in the dark, passed down from generation to generation as a warning. It begins, as all the best nightmares do, with a family that seemed perfectly normal. In the autumn of 1888, the small, unincorporated community of Cutter's Hollow, Missouri, was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business. It was a town that existed in the shadow of the Ozarks, a cluster of perhaps 60 souls who made their living from the land and from the nearby railway line that cut through the valley. It was a quiet, simple existence defined by the rhythm of the seasons and the clang of the blacksmith's hammer. The air there had a particular scent, a mix of damp earth, wood smoke, and the sweet, cloying smell of the wild crabapple trees that grew along the creek bed. It was the smell of simplicity, and it was into this tapestry of simple lives that the Ashford family arrived. They were a small, unassuming group. Samuel Ashford, a man of about 40, was a cobbler by trade. He was a quiet, thin man with a perpetual stoop to his shoulders, as if he were always carrying a weight that no one else could see. He wore spectacles with thick, dark frames that always seemed to be slightly askew on his nose, and his hands were a roadmap of calluses and old scars, the tools of his trade. His wife, Eleanor, was a pale, ethereal woman, rarely seen by the townsfolk. She was described in the few surviving documents as nervous and reclusive. She had eyes that were a shade too large for her face, and she seemed to startle at the slightest sound, like a bird sensing a coming storm. They had 3 children, 2 daughters, Mary and Beth, aged 10 and 8, and a son, little Samuel Jr., who was only 5. The family purchased a dilapidated farmhouse at the end of Willow Lane, a narrow, rutted road that seemed to be swallowed by the forest on either side. It was a far cry from a welcoming home. The house was a 2-story structure of warped, gray wood, its paint long since peeled away by the harsh Missouri weather, leaving it looking like the exposed bones of some great, dead animal. The windows were like dark, soulless eyes that stared out at the world with a vacant, unblinking gaze. The property was overgrown, the yard choked with waste, high weeds and blackberry brambles that snagged at clothing and skin. The roof sagged in the middle, and the front porch tilted at a dangerous angle, as if it were slowly sinking into the earth. It was the kind of place that sensible people would have walked away from. But the Ashfords didn't. They arrived on a Thursday, just as the sun was beginning its descent, painting the sky in hues of blood orange and bruised purple. The whole town watched, a collection of curious, wary faces peering through lace curtains and from behind screened doors. They came in a single, nondescript wagon, loaded with a few pieces of furniture and a mountain of large, wooden crates, each one stenciled with a single, cryptic word, AHFORD, and a crude drawing of a boot. There was nothing ostentatious about them. They were, by all accounts, a perfectly ordinary family seeking a fresh start. Samuel Ashford was immediately taken into the community, his skills as a cobbler proving useful in a town that had to send its shoes to the city for mending. He was polite, if a bit reserved, and he did good, honest work. He was, however, a creature of habit. He would work in his small shop, a converted shed attached to the side of the house, from dawn until the last sliver of light had vanished from the sky. He rarely left his property, except to visit the general store for supplies, and when he did, he was always alone. He never brought his wife or children to town, the townsfolk being good, God-fearing people. Put it down to a family that was simply keeping to themselves, perhaps grieving a loss or dealing with a private matter. They didn't pry. And so the Ashfords, with their quiet ways and their ramshackle house, became a part of the landscape of Cutter's Hollow, a piece of background noise that no one paid much attention to, until the first incident. It was a cold Sunday in November, 3 months after they had arrived. The church service had just let out, and the congregation was milling about in the churchyard, exchanging pleasantries and the latest gossip. One of the parishioners, a farmer named Elias Croft, was standing with his wife, Martha. He was known to be a bit of a talker, but on this day, his words weren't about the weather. "Saw something peculiar this morning," he muttered, a strange, uneasy look in his eyes. He glanced around, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial whisper. "On the Ashford place." Martha leaned in, her curiosity piqued.
"What was it, Elias?"
"Don't keep me in suspense. I was driving by, taking my cattle to the north pasture, and I saw the Ashford boy, little Samuel Jr., playing on the back porch," Elias said, his brow furrowed. "He was just sitting there, in that cold, in nothing but his nightshirt, barefoot, and he had a line of shoes in front of him. Must have been 20 or 30 pairs, all laid out in a perfect circle around him." Martha scoffed. "He's a cobbler's son, Elias. Of course he's got shoes." "That's just the thing, Martha," Elias insisted, his voice growing more serious. "They weren't the boy's shoes. They were all different sizes, shapes, and colors. Some looked like men's work boots, others like fancy women's slippers. Some were tiny, like a baby shoe. And the boy, he was just staring at them. Not playing with them. Just staring. Like he was waiting for something." Martha dismissed it as a child's imagination, but the image stuck with her. A splinter of unease that burrowed under her skin. She wasn't the only one. Over the following weeks, a pattern of such observations began to emerge. Mrs. Gable, the postmaster's wife, was taking a shortcut through the woods when she passed by the Ashford property. The air was still and silent, and she paused for a moment to catch her breath. From the edge of the tree line, she could see into the back of the house, through a grimy window. She saw Mrs. Ashford, standing in the kitchen, her back to the window. On the floor around her, arranged in concentric circles, were more shoes. Dozens and dozens of shoes. They covered almost the entire floor of the room. The woman was not moving. She was just standing there, her head bowed, as if in prayer, surrounded by a silent congregation of empty footwear. Mrs. Gable didn't mention it to anyone at first, but she couldn't shake the image from her mind. It was just so unnatural. Then there was the matter of the shoes themselves. For a family of 5, they seemed to have a bottomless supply. The local store owner, a gruff but fair man named Mr. Henderson, noted that Samuel Ashford would occasionally come in to purchase large quantities of leather and cobbler's tools. But the amount of leather he bought was staggering. It was enough to supply a small army. And yet, the Ashfords were never seen wearing any new shoes. Their own footwear was always old, worn, and patched. What was he doing with all that leather? But the most chilling detail, the one that would be seared into the memory of Cutter's Hollow, came from a teenager named Billy Mason. Billy was a curious, adventurous boy of 15, the type who was always poking his nose where it didn't belong. One afternoon, fueled by boredom and a reckless sense of courage, he decided to explore the Ashford property, while he knew Mr. Ashford was in town. He crept through the overgrown yard, his heart pounding in his chest. He peered into the window of the cobbler's shed and saw a sight that he would carry with him to his grave. The room was filled with shelves, floor to ceiling, every single one of them crammed with shoes. But they weren't just arranged in any fashion. They were meticulously organized. All the shoes on the left wall were brown. The ones on the right wall were black. In the middle of the room was a large workbench, and on it sat a single, partially completed shoe. But it was the smell that got to Billy. It was the scent of leather, yes, but there was another smell underneath it. It was a metallic, coppery smell. It was the smell of dried blood. Billy didn't stay long. He turned and ran from the property, his footsteps thundering in his ears. He told his father, who told the sheriff, who was a pragmatic man named Jedidiah Turner. Sheriff Turner was a stout man with a thick, bushy mustache and a keen sense of observation. He had been the sheriff of Cutter's Hollow for 20 years, and he had seen a lot of strange things. But he prided himself on his ability to sniff out trouble. He dismissed Billy's story as the overactive imagination of a boy who had read too many penny dreadfuls. The smell of blood, he reasoned, was probably just the smell of leather dyes and sealants. Still, the sheer number of shoes was a bit odd. He decided to pay a visit to the Ashford home to satisfy his own, and the town's, growing curiosity. The next day, he rode his horse down the muddy track of Willow Lane. The house looked even more foreboding in the gray light of the afternoon. As he dismounted, he noticed the silence. It was a heavy, oppressive silence, broken only by the creak of his saddle and the wind whispering through the bare branches of the trees. Not a bird sang, not a dog barked. It was as if the very land itself was holding its breath. He knocked on the front door. The sound was swallowed by the thick, dead air. He waited. No answer. He knocked again, harder this time. The door groaned on its hinges but remained closed. He was about to knock a third time when he heard a shuffling sound from inside. The sound of a door opening and closing. Then silence. He pressed his ear to the wood, trying to hear a voice, a footstep, anything. He heard nothing but the slow, rhythmic ticking of a clock. "Mr. Ashford," the sheriff called out. "It's Sheriff Turner. I'd like to have a word with you." Silence. He tried the door. It was unlocked. He pushed it open, the hinges screeching like a wounded animal. The interior of the house was dark, smelling of dust and age and something else, something sweet and decayed, like rotting flowers. "Hello, is anyone home?" he called out. He stepped into the main room. The house was cluttered, but not in a chaotic way. It was a strange, organized clutter. Every surface was covered in something. Books, tools, rags, and everywhere, were the shoes. They were piled in corners, stacked on tables, hanging from hooks on the walls. The floor was barely visible beneath their presence. There were high, buttoned boots, dusty and worn. There were delicate dancing slippers with frayed ribbons. There were tiny, child-sized brogans. There were massive, heavy, soled-work boots that looked like they were made for a giant. Sheriff Turner felt the hair on the back of his neck stand on end. His heart began to beat a little faster. It was a deeply, profoundly unsettling sight. There was no rhyme or reason to it, a grotesque collection of the everyday. He moved further into the room, stepping carefully over the cluttered floor. He heard a creak from upstairs, the sound of a floorboard bending under a weight. "Who's up there?" he shouted, his voice echoing in the silent space. He walked to the base of the stairs, his hand instinctively resting on the butt of his pistol. The staircase was narrow and steep, the steps worn down in the middle by years of use. He began to ascend, each step groaning in protest beneath his boots. A cold draft seemed to be descending from the top of the stairs, carrying with it that same sweet, sickly smell. "I'm coming up," he announced, his voice a little less steady than he would have liked. The landing at the top of the stairs was dark, lit only by the dim, watery light filtering through a window at the end of the hall. There were 2 closed doors. The sound had come from the one on the left. He slowly walked towards it, the boards beneath his feet groaning with each step. He reached for the brass knob, his fingers cold and clammy. The handle turned with a soft, grinding click. He pushed the door open and saw Eleanor Ashford. She was sitting in a rocking chair by a window, her back to him, her silhouette framed by the gray light. She was wearing a simple, dark dress. Her hair was a wild tangle of gray and brown spilling down her back, and on the floor around her, just as Mrs. Gable had described, were the shoes, arranged in that same perfect, concentric circle. They were completely immobile. "Mrs. Ashford," he said softly. She didn't turn. She didn't acknowledge him in any way. She just kept rocking, a slow, rhythmic, hypnotic motion. The only sound in the room was the gentle creak of the rocker and the ticking of a clock. "Mrs. Ashford." He tried again, his voice a little louder. "I'm Sheriff Turner. I just wanted to ask you and your husband a few questions." There was no response. The rocking continued. He took a step closer, his foot brushing against a worn, leather boot. He looked around the room. There was a small, child's bed in the corner, unoccupied, but made with military precision. A wardrobe stood against one wall, its doors slightly ajar. He could see the faint shapes of clothes inside. He cleared his throat, a nervous habit. "Where is your husband, Mayim? Where are your children?" He was beginning to feel a deep, primal fear now. The kind of fear that makes a man want to turn and run, but keeps his feet frozen to the ground. The silence in the room was not just empty. It was expectant. Just as he was about to ask again, he noticed something. There was something beneath the rocking chair. It was a shoe, but it was different from the others. It was a child's shoe, a tiny little boot, and it was covered in a dark, rusty stain. His eyes narrowed, his mind refusing to connect the dots. "Mrs. Ashford," he began. Slowly, impossibly slowly, Eleanor Ashford's head began to turn. It was a movement so gradual, so deliberate, that it seemed to take an eternity. The joints in her neck made a faint, dry clicking sound. She was turning to face him. It was then that he saw her eyes. They were not the eyes of a nervous or reclusive woman. They were the eyes of something else entirely. They were wide, staring, devoid of any emotion, but filled with a terrible intensity. The face beneath them was pale, almost waxy. But what struck the sheriff more than anything was the faint smile that began to play at the corners of her mouth. It was a small, serene smile, a smile that was utterly at odds with the madness of the room. "The shoes," she whispered, her voice a dry, rasping sound, like leaves skittering across a tombstone. "They must be ready for the children." Her gaze drifted past the sheriff, focusing on something beyond him, something in the corner of the room that he hadn't yet noticed. He turned his head to follow her line of sight, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. It was a small, wooden cupboard, its door slightly ajar. He didn't want to see what was inside, but his body was no longer his own. He was being compelled by a force he didn't understand. He took a step toward the cupboard, his boot making a wet, sucking sound on the floorboards, a sound that felt obscene in the dead silence. He noticed the smell again, stronger now. The sweet, wrought and iron smell that seemed to emanate from the cupboard. "Sheriff. They're so restless." The voice was a faint, pained whisper, but it didn't come from the rocking chair. It came from behind him. He spun around, his hand now firmly on his pistol. But the room was empty. The rocking chair was still. Mrs. Ashford was gone. The air was thick with the stench of fear. He was alone in the room, alone with the circle of shoes and the awful silence. He turned back to the cupboard, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The door was still ajar, beckoning him with its dark, silent opening. With a trembling hand, He reached out and pulled it open. It groaned a long, painful sound and swung wide, revealing its contents to the dim light of the room. The cupboard was not filled with clothing or linens. It was filled with shoes. But these shoes were different. They were covered in dust and cobwebs, more neglected than the others. And they had something attached to them. He saw them at the bottom of the cupboard, a tangled heap of leather and something white. The first thing he saw was a tiny, porcelain-like object. It was a foot. A child's foot, still wearing a sock, the end of it preserved in a kind of grisly, dried-out state. It was connected to the shoe by a dried, blackened strip of what might have once been sinew. He stumbled backward, a violent cry of revulsion and terror escaping his lips. His back hit the wall, hard, knocking the air from his lungs. He stared at the grisly object, his mind refusing to process what he was seeing. It couldn't be real. This was a nightmare. He had to get out of the house. He turned and ran. No longer a sheriff, no longer a man in control, but a terrified animal fleeing a predator. He didn't go down the stairs. He didn't have the presence of mind. He just ran, bursting through a door at the end of the hall that led to a small, enclosed stairway, perhaps a servant's staircase, plunging him into near, total darkness. He tumbled down the narrow, winding steps, his hands scraping against the rough wooden walls, his feet slipping on the grimy, uneven steps. He finally burst through a door at the bottom, finding himself in the cellar. A single, guttering oil lamp sat on a shelf, casting long, dancing shadows across the room. The air here was cold and smelled of earth and decay. He stood still for a moment, trying to get his bearings, trying to slow his frantic breathing. He was in a large, dirt-floored cellar. It was dry and cool, cluttered with the usual detritus of a farmhouse. Old tools, broken furniture, jars of preserved vegetables, and, of course, more shoes. They were everywhere, but here they were different. They were stacked in neat, orderly piles against the walls, like logs in a woodpile. He took a step forward, and his foot brushed against a small, wooden sign, half buried in the dirt. He bent down and picked it up. It was the nameplate from a child's bed. The name on it was Mary. He dropped it as if it had burned him. His eyes adjusted to the gloom and he saw it. In the corner of the cellar, where the shadows were deepest, there was a grave. It was a shallow grave, its dirt still fresh and loose. And next to it, lying discarded in the dirt, was a small girl's shoe. It was pristine, as if brand new, the leather smooth and unblemished. And it was the only shoe in the entire house that was not paired with a second. His mind flashed back to all the little details he'd been ignoring. The 3 children, the hundreds of shoes, the obsession, the unusual supplies, the quiet, the sickly sweet smell. He didn't realize he'd been holding his breath until he saw the glint of a shiny object in the loose soil, right by the grave. He dropped to his knees, a new horror crawling up his throat. His fingers, numb and clumsy, scraped at the dirt. He thought he was digging up the body of little Mary, bracing himself for the worst. But as the dirt fell away, his hand closed around the object. It was a leather-bound journal. He clutched it to his chest, the leather feeling strangely warm against his cold, clammy hands. The dirt on it was fresh, but there was something else on the cover. A dark, dried smudge. He didn't have the courage to open it. Not there. Not in that place. He scrambled to his feet, clutching the journal, his eyes scanning the cellar for an exit. He saw a small, warped door on the far wall that led outside. He stumbled towards it, pushing against it with his shoulder. It gave way with a grinding groan, and he tumbled out into the gray afternoon light, gasping for breath like a drowning man. He was lying in the tall, wild grass of the Ashford's backyard. He blinked against the sudden brightness. The the cool air a shocking relief after the suffocating atmosphere of the cellar. For a long moment, he just lay there, the journal pressed against his chest, his body shaking with a tremor he couldn't control. He looked back at the house. It stood there, silent and indifferent, its dark windows staring down at him like the empty eyes of a skull. The town was buzzing. Sheriff Turner had ridden back from the Ashford place looking like a ghost, his face drained of all color, his eyes wide with a terror he couldn't articulate to the gathering crowd. When they pressed him for details, he just muttered the words, the shoes," and locked himself in his office. He didn't come out for a full day. And then the Ashfords disappeared, just like that. The very next morning, the wagon was gone. The house was empty. The only sign that anyone had ever lived there was the lingering foul smell and a note pinned to the front door. It was a single sentence written in a cramped, spidery hand. The family is complete. A search party was organized. Men and women from Cutter's Hollow, armed with lanterns and courage, scoured the property. They found the grisly trophies in the cupboard. They found the small, shallow grave in the cellar. But when they dug deeper, they found not just one grave, but three. The remains of the Ashford children were exhumed, their small, fragile bones a testament to a horror no one could comprehend. But the real shock came later, when the coroner examined them. A vicious, dark, and terrible secret was laid bare. The children had not been murdered. They were in a state of preservation, yes, but their deaths were natural. The children had simply died, all three of them, at different times over the course of several years. And every single time, after they died, their mother, Eleanor, a woman consumed by a grief that had curdled into an unimaginable madness, would do something beyond the comprehension of a sane mind. Samuel Ashford, the grieving father, had a way to preserve the memory of his children. He was a cobbler. He would take each child's foot, as if it were a last remaining piece of them, and he would make a shoe for it. But it was more than that. He didn't just make shoes in their memory. He made the shoes for their ghosts, for the restless spirits of his children. He believed they still needed them, to walk the earth, to be near them. The hundreds of other shoes were not for the living, nor were they for the dead. They were the shoes of the damned, a macabre collection for the children who would never grow up. And then, on that final night, Samuel, broken by the weight of this madness, did the unthinkable. He had the tools. He had the leather. And he had a wife who was a relentless, whispering specter of his own guilt. He buried his family in the only way he knew how. He made them new shoes. And then he took his own life. His last act a terrible testament to a love that had been twisted into the darkest form of preservation. The real tragedy of the Ashford family is not in the macabre details of the shoes or the cellar. No, the true horror is the slow, creeping madness of grief. It's the story of a father who could not let go, a mother who found her reality bleeding into a world of shadows and whispers, and three children who never stood a chance against the weight of their parents' love. It's a cautionary tale about what happens when the line between love and obsession blurs and finally dissolves. The town of Cutter's Hollow tried to move on. They burned the house down, hoping that the fire would cleanse the land of its taint. But they say that the land remembers. To this day, hunters and hikers who venture too deep into the woods near where Willow Lane used to be speak of strange things. They whisper about hearing the sound of children playing in the dead of night, their laughter echoing through the trees. They tell tales of finding small, perfectly crafted shoes in the undergrowth, as if they were left for someone who is no longer there to wear them. Some of the older folks, the ones who remember the story, refused to go anywhere near the old Ashford property. They say that at twilight, if you stand in the right spot, you can see the faint flicker of a lantern moving through the trees. And you can hear the sound of a man weeping. And the journal, the one Sheriff Turner found in the cellar, it was never made public. It was locked away in a vault in the county records office. Its contents deemed too disturbing for public consumption. But rumors persist about what was written in its pages. They say it wasn't just a diary. They say it was a guide. A meticulous, detailed record of the methods Samuel used, the exact number of shoes he made, and the dates of his children's deaths. And they say it ended with a final, chilling entry. A plan. The final entry simply read, "They will never be alone. I have made enough shoes for them all. They will walk forever." The sheer volume of shoes was never explained. One could only assume he believed they were for the children he might have had, for the friends they might have made, for the family they could have been. It was a map of a grief that spiraled into the infinite. No one ever asked why the family owned 200 shoes. They had 3 children. No one wanted to know. But some secrets are buried so deep that they claw their way back out from the earth. Searching for someone, anyone who is brave enough to listen. What do you think was in that final entry of the journal? What other twisted rituals might the Ashfords have performed to cope with their unbearable grief? Let me know in the comments below. And remember, the stories that haunt us the most are often the ones we try to forget. Until next time, sleep well.